I often get questions like, how do Chinese people whisper? Can you still understand when someone is not using their voice at all? What happens if someone whispers in Chinese? How does that affect the tones? These are really interesting questions. Chinese has tones, but when we whisper, there's no vocal cord vibration to produce pitch, which tones mainly rely on. So do tones just disappear? Today we're going to talk about, can Chinese, a tonal language, be whispered? Do tones still exist in whispering? Let's start by answering the first question. Can Chinese, a tonal language, be whispered? When we're in a library or in situations where we have to speak very softly, it would be really inconvenient if we couldn't whisper. So yes, even though Chinese is a tonal language, we can still whisper and generally understand each other. 我们可以这样说话. But then you might wonder, do tones still exist in whispering? This is a very great question because we know that tones mainly rely on pitch, which is produced by vibrating our vocal cords. Ah, 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 ah. Since we don't vibrate our vocal cords when whispering, the usual sense of pitch is lost. Ah, 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 ah. So do tones still exist then? I've looked into this, and the research findings on this topic is actually quite mixed. Some studies found that tones are still reflected somehow in whispering, and the recognition scores were pretty good. Although we don't have pitch to reflect tones in whispering, research suggests that tones also manifest differences in stress and length, which may act as cues for their recognition in whispered speech. So we know that there's not only pitch, but also other secondary cues associated with tones that help us recognize them. For example, when tones are produced in isolation, each tone has a different duration. Their lengths are different. The third tone is the longest, and the fourth tone is the shortest. In addition, tones also vary in amplitude, which relates to the loudness or intensity of a sound. Typically, the louder a sound is, the greater its amplitude. So you can see that the fourth tone starts off loud and becomes much quieter very quickly, which is quite different from the other tones. Now listen to each tone and pay attention to how loud or soft they sound. Ah, ah. For the first tone, you can hear that the sound remains at a consistent loudness. The volume stays the same for a while. Ma, ba, pa. Now the second tone. Ah, ah. The sound starts quieter and then becomes louder. Ma, ba, pa. The third tone, when it's pronounced in isolation, is often a falling rising tone. So its intensity varies. Ah, ba. The fourth tone. Ah, ah. It starts loud and then quickly becomes quieter. Ma, ba. So other than pitch, tones also differ in their length and loudness, and these features are still retained in whispering. Interestingly, research has also found that if you whisper a bit louder, it can help people recognize the fourth tone better. Sounds promising, right? We can rely on all these secondary cues to help us pick up on tones. But here's the catch. They might not be as reliable as we'd like to think. Many studies have shown that in whispered speech, tone recognition drops drastically compared to normal speech. Especially for the first and second tones. They are really hard to recognize. The third tone and the fourth tone are better, likely because their duration and amplitude are more distinctive. So now we know that the absence of F0 has a major impact on tone perception. F0 is the fundamental frequency which we perceive as pitch. Without it, it becomes much harder to hear tones. What's even worse is that these secondary cues like duration and amplitude that help us identify the third and fourth tone in isolation may become less clear or even disappear in continuous speech. This is because many factors in a sentence like emphasis and pauses can affect the duration and intensity of sounds. So even the better than chance tone perception for some of the tones may largely disappear in whispered continuous speech. In other words, although people can sometimes recognize whispered tones better than random guessing, this ability may mostly disappear in whispered continuous speech. So unfortunately, it seems that when we whisper in Chinese, it's really hard to hear and distinguish tones. But why can we still understand each other? In this situation, the context in which something is said plays a really important role in understanding meaning. And also, it's likely that whispering typically occurs in situations where people know each other well and the topic of conversation is familiar to the participants. So it's rather easy for us to understand each other in these kinds of circumstances. Without context like this, it can be quite hard for us to distinguish tones in whispered speech. So to sum up, yes, in Chinese, we can still whisper and understand each other, but whether or not tones still exist in whispered speech needs further investigation. They might show up through other cues in the sound, such as its duration, how long it lasts, and its amplitude, how loud or intense it is. Many studies show that listeners can still distinguish the third and fourth tones to some extent, likely due to their distinctive patterns in duration and amplitude. However, these results come from experiments using isolated tones, which might not apply to natural continuous speech. But luckily, when we whisper, we usually have enough context to understand what the other person means. It seems like when we whisper, tones don't seem to matter as much. So if you speak Chinese with incorrect tones, can people still understand you? The answer is yes, people may still understand you, but they will have to rely more heavily on context to guess your meaning. This means your listeners have to put in extra mental effort just to keep up. If you want to communicate smoothly without making your listener work too hard to understand you, getting your tones right is still very important. To help students master Chinese tones, I've spent years studying them in depth and developed an online course to help you build a solid foundation and understand how they work in real speech. If you have found these research-based insights helpful, I think you will enjoy this course as well. I've simplified many key concepts about tones and included particle tips to help you master them. I'm also offering a 20% discount for the first 30 people who use the code TONE20. In addition, if you'd like to visualize your pitch and compare your tones with a native speaker's, check out this video where I introduce a very useful tool that can help you do exactly that. Alright, that's the end of this video. Thanks so much for your curiosity and questions. That's what inspired today's video. If there's anything else you'd like me to talk about, feel free to leave a comment below. Also, 如果你喜欢今天的影片，别忘记按赞、订阅和分享哦。You can also support me on my Patreon and get exclusive learning content. Last but not least, if you'd like to learn some daily Mandarin expressions, check out my Instagram, Grace Mandarin. 那我们下次见喽，拜拜。